Hey, and welcome to OTR Miniatures. So far on the channel, the most successful video has been the easy and effective method for painting termagants. And I received a comment on that video asking if the method in that would work well with red instead of purple. So recently I experimented with multiple recipes for red and black termagants, and here are the results, starting with the red bodies. For the first of the red bodies, I'm going to start with the simplest recipe, which is to begin by priming with Wraithbone from Citadel. Then using blood red speed paint from the Army Painter, give it a good coat. You can use any bone colour for priming, it gives it a warmer finish than white and is great for a colour like red. Then simply leave it to dry and you are done. One finished red body. Speed paint and contrast have revolutionised the way that I paint minis. For this one, I again started by priming with Wraithbone, and then using contrast black Templar from Citadel, I gave it a coat to act as a pre-shade. Once that was dry, the next step is to use Wraithbone and give it a top-down dry brush using a small dry brush. This helps to increase the contrast between the high points and the recesses. Then, using Contrast Blood Angels Red, glaze over the entire body. And once that's dry, you are left with a nice deep red that has a good variety of tones and shades. If you compare it to just the speed paint on its own, then you can see that it's less vibrant, but for not too much more effort, you get what I think is a much better finish. For this one I began with a black primer. I used Chaos Black from Citadel, but any black will do. Then using Uniform Grey from the Army Painter and a medium dry brush, I gave it a fairly heavy all over dry brush. Then using Matte White from the Army Painter and a small dry brush, I gave it a top-down dry brush, picking out the raised detail and pre-highlighting any of the edges. After this I used Contrast Blood Angels Red from Citadel and glazed it on. This gave a nice cherry red finish. For this one I began with a grey primer. I used Mechanicus Standard Grey from Citadel, but any grey will do. Then using Skeleton Bone from the Army Painter and a medium dry brush, I did an all over dry brush, leaving just the recesses in grey. Then with Matte White from the Army Painter and a small dry brush, I again did a top down dry brush to pick out the raised detail and pre-highlight the edges. Then I glazed on Contrast Blood Angels Red from Citadel. This gave a nice tomato red finish. And if you compare it to the previous method, you can see it produces a brighter, warmer red, so it just depends on personal preference. This method starts with a Wraithbone prime, followed by a base coat of Corn Red from Citadel. I used a wet palette from the Army Painter to thin my paint and found that one coat gives sufficient coverage with this paint. Then once this has dried, using a medium dry brush and Mephiston Red from Citadel, I gave it an all over dry brush, leaving the Corn Red in just the recesses. And followed this up with a small dry brush and Evil Sun Scarlet from Citadel to just pick out the highest points of the raised detail and the edges. This gives a nice rich red for little effort. For the final red body recipe, I started with a Wraithbone prime and then a base coat of Corn Red. Once this had dried, I gave it a wash of Nuln Oil in order to shade the recesses. The next step is to bring up the vibrancy of the red. For this I used Mephiston Red from Citadel and painted roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of the body again, leaving the recessed areas and any area that would be shaded. I thinned the paint with water using a wet palette from the Army Painter, and I did one fairly thin coat. This really helped to increase the contrast of the piece. I then did another thin coat, covering roughly 2/3 of the area I had just done, focusing on the parts that would get more light. This creates a nice transition from dark to light on the model. You can see this when we compare it to the one we did with pre-shading and contrast. To push it even further, I did a third thin coat of this, just on the parts that would get the most light, using scratchy patterns to add a little bit of texture. final part of this recipe is to use Evil Sun Scarlet from Citadel and do a thin coat just on the uppermost parts of the model, again using scratchy patterns. Don't worry about staying inside of what you've previously painted, as it will create some more natural looking transitions. Just focus on where the light would hit the most. Also at this stage, do any edge highlighting that is required. And once dry, you end up with this. What do you think? That's all my red body experimenting done. Which recipe would you use on your army? Leave a comment down below. Let's move on to the black bodies. For the first of the black bodies, I started with a Wraithbone Prime. Then using Grim Black Speed Paint from the Army Painter, I did a good covering all over the body, and it was done. Now that was nice and simple. For this one I started with a black prime, followed by an overbrushing of uniform grey, and then a top-down dry brush of matte white. Then using contrast black Templar, I glazed over this for a nice smooth black with a good amount of depth in the recesses. If you compare this to the previous method, I much prefer the finish that this gives, for not a lot more work. For this one I started with a Mechanica Standard Grey Prime, followed by an overbrushing of Skeleton Bone, and then a top-down dry brush of matte white. Then using contrast black Templar, I glazed over the body the same as I did with the previous one. This gave a lighter finish than the previous example, and has a good amount of contrast between the raised areas and the recesses. Which one do you prefer? And is it worth the extra effort than the speed paint alone? This recipe begins with a black prime. Then using a small dry brush and corn red, give the body a light top-down dry brush to pick out any raised details and highlight the edges. I'm not sure if this reads as black or dark red, but I quite like the almost coppery tones it gives. Let me know what you think of this. For this one I started with a Wraithbone Prime, and then used Grim Black Speed Paint for the base coat and recess shading. Then just like the previous termagant, I used a small dry brush and corn red to pick out the raised details and highlight the edges. This created a subtle effect and prevented the black from looking too flat. For the final black body, I began by spraying Chaos Black from the bottom up in order to put in the shadows. Then using Mechanica Standard Grey, I sprayed from the top down at a roughly 45-degree angle in order to put in the midtones. And I followed this up with Grey Sear and sprayed from directly above in order to finish the Zenithal Prime. This created a good base in order to paint from. Then I shaded it with Nuln Oil in order to darken the grey and shade the recesses, in order for it to read as black. I think it may have been better to use a 50-50 mix of black contrast or speed paint and medium. One of those recipes looks really good. Maybe a recipe with some blue edge highlighting would look really good in order for it to contrast with the red, but that'll be one for another video. Anyway, now we have the bodies done, let's see the results of the experiments with the carapace, starting with the black. Starting with the carapace to go with the simplest red body recipe, which was done using blood red speed paint, I did the carapace using Grim Black Speed Paint. Just take a bit of care not to get it on any of the red. And once dried, you end up with a pretty effective red and black scheme that would be very quick to complete a whole unit with. Next up is the black to go with the pre-shaded red contrast body, and for the carapace on this one, I'm going to use the same technique, starting by pre-shading with black Templar, which on flatter areas looks patchy. So the next step is to use a small dry brush, and being careful not to get any on the red, do a dry brush with Wraithbone. This helps to highlight the edges and boost the contrast. And then follow this up with another coat of contrast black Templar. This gives a much smoother, deeper finish than just the one coat of contrast. If you compare it just to the speed paint, I think it is a much better finish for not too much more effort. The base of this one is a black prime, followed by an overbrush of uniform grey, and then a dry brush of matte white. I followed this up by glazing on contrast black Templar, which gives you a smooth finish with some of the texture from the dry brushing still visible. If you compare it to the previous Termagant, it is not as dark but has more visible tones. The base of this one is a Mechanicus standard grey prime, followed by an overbrush of skeleton bone and then a dry brush of matte white. Then the same as with the previous Termagant, I glazed on a layer of contrast black Templar. This gives a finish that mostly reads as black, but I think that some areas are closer to dark grey. You can see this when you compare it to the previous Termagant. I probably wouldn't use this recipe, but let me know what you think. This is the Termagant that had a base of Corn Red, followed by an overbrush of Mephiston Red, and then a dry brush of Evil Sun Scarlet. So for the black carapace, we are starting with a Wraithbone Prime, and then giving it a coat of matte black from the Army Painter. Then for the next step, I use uniform grey and a brush with a good tip in order to paint lines on the carapace. Start your lines between 2/3 and half of the way up each plate and end at the edges. The lines don't have to be completely uniform, and it doesn't matter if some overlap slightly. Also, during this stage, edge highlight all the plates, including the central ridge, until you are left with something that resembles this. Then, using matte white, do the same again, but only covering 2/3 to half of the grey. Make these lines more separated, so you can still see plenty of grey between them. It will make the pattern stand out more. Next, I glazed on a layer of contrast black Templar. But when you do it, use a 50-50 mix with medium, because you can see mine has darkened it too much and has obscured some of the detail. The final black armour recipe is on the red body that I put the most effort into, so this will need to be of equal quality. This starts with a Wraithbone Prime, but that isn't necessary for this recipe. A black prime would be the easiest to start from. My first step was to give it a base coat of matte black. Then using uniform grey, which I thinned with water on my wet palette, and again using a brush with a good tip, I painted dots onto the carapace. These covered up to 2/3 of each plate, and were closer together towards the edges in order to create a transition from black to grey. Also during this stage, edge highlight the plates and the central ridge. You should get something resembling this, which is a great start. Then using matte white, I again painted on dots, but only covering up to 2/3 of the grey area. Again, these are more concentrated towards the edges, which will give you this, which I think looks great. Next we need to make this read as black armour. So after my mistake of not thinning the black Templar on the previous Termagant, I decided to test Nuln Oil to see how it would work. This dulled the grey down nicely, and overall I think it reads as black, but I think the white might be slightly too bright. So in future I'd probably use a light grey, or mix the white with some grey beforehand. But this is by far my favourite of the red bodies and black carapace, and probably my best painted mini to date. I think we've got some good options there, or at least an idea of where to start from. Let's check out the red recipes. We're going to start with the simplest red carapace in order to match the simplest black body. So starting with the Wraithbone Prime, paint on some blood red speed paint, taking care not to get it on the black. Leave it to dry, and you get this nice vibrant red, which looks great considering how little effort it took. This recipe starts the same as the previous one, so begin with a Wraithbone Prime, followed by blood red speed paint. Then I dry brushed on Corn Red. I can't find the clip of me doing the dry brushing, but this is what it looks like finished. It adds more variety of tones to the red, but if you compare it to the speed paint alone, I'm not sure it's worth the effort. What do you think? This recipe begins with a black prime, followed by a grey overbrush and then a white dry brush. Then I glazed on contrast Blood Angels Red. This gives a deep rich red that has plenty of contrast between the recesses and the edges. It's a lot less effort than edge highlighting for very similar results. This recipe begins with a grey prime, followed by a bone over brush and then a white dry brush. Then, just like the previous termagant, I glazed on contrast blood red. Which gives a warmer red, but it has less difference between the shadows and the highlights. You can see this when you compare the two. But both look great, so it's just a case of personal preference. Which one would you choose? For this one, I decided to experiment with adding some texture to the armour. So starting with a black prime, my first step was to use uniform grey and brush on some lines to cover between half and 2/3 of each plate. Leave gaps between the lines so you can still see some black, and do your edge highlighting during this stage. Then repeat with matte white, but only covering half to 2/3 of the grey, but don't do the edge highlighting with the white. Then you end up with a familiar looking carapace, but this time we're going to finish it by glazing on contrast Blood Angels red. Which gives what I think is a great finish. It's a bit dark overall, so I may experiment with a grey prime, then light grey, then white to see how that looks. The texture in this reminds me of leaves for some reason. For the final red carapace recipe, I wanted to mimic the coconut crab style of the final black recipe, so I started with a base coat of corn red. And then used Nuln Oil to darken it and shade the recesses. I then followed this up with Mephiston red and painted on dots to cover between half and 2/3 of each plate, concentrating them more towards the edges. Also, edge highlight each plate and the central ridge. Giving you a nice transition and some texture. The final step is to use Evil Sun Scarlet and paint dots to cover roughly half of the area of the Mephiston red. Leave gaps between the dots so that the detail can easily be seen. And you'll get a result like this, which I am very happy with. And am now torn between these two as to which one is my favourite pattern. I think I'll have to try the lines, but with this recipe, as it is definitely my favourite overall red carapace. Which do you prefer, and what combo of body and armour recipe would you use? Let me know and I'll paint a monster that way. I would love to see your results of using any of these recipes, so either tag me on Instagram or TikTok, or post it to my Facebook group. I'll leave the link in the description. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.